Hi, in this episode, we're going to be talking about a really particular topic, and it's a really important topic that I think every dietitian, every person supporting people with binge eating should talk about. So, this topic is basically how to manage difficult emotions before and after a binge. Sure, we can teach how to manage binge eating episodes during the binge or what can trigger binge episodes, but eventually, during binge eating recovery, we're always going to, 99% of the time during binge eating recovery, there's a good chance you are going to have a binge eating episodes. And if you're going to recover from binge eating episodes fully, what you need to do is to expect disappointment. And it might sound a bit bad or a bit difficult to hear, but basically just expect that you are going to binge during recovery. And one of the key things is how can you manage your difficult emotions before and after a binge? When you're having difficult urges, you're starting to feel like you're going to prepare for a binge. And after a binge, what are you going to do when those difficult emotions come? When you just had a binge and then the guilt is coming, the shame is coming, the embarrassment is coming. What are you going to do? So let's get straight to the episode. So the first thing I need to mention is that why are we having these difficult emotions? Why can other people just manage their guilt with food much better than people who are struggling with binge eating? Well, the reason is essentially that people who are struggling with binge eating have poorer emotional regulation skills. And I'm not trying to say it in a bad way, because essentially when I struggle with binge eating, if anyone told me that I had poor emotional regulation skills, I would be quite annoyed because I tried my best to try to be a better person. But people struggling with binge eating have poor emotional regulation skills. That's what the evidence shows. And the reason why is not because you're not working hard enough or you're not caring, you're not loving. Essentially, what triggers poor emotional regulation skills is when we have invalidation in our lives. So what does invalidation look like? So maybe when you were younger, did you have parents who always told you when you were scared, they kept on telling you, oh, don't be scared, it's not that scary. That's invalidation. Maybe when you were younger, you were crying a lot, and then maybe your parents told you, oh, just don't be sad, it's gonna be much better. Or don't be sad, there's too many people, to stop crying, there's too many people around us, you're embarrassing us. Rather than saying, oh, what's wrong? Tell me more about it. So if they're quite invalidating with your experiences or with your emotions, that can lead to poor emotional regulation skills because we're trying to bottle up our feelings, even as adults or much older children, essentially teenagers, shall I say. When you were being bullied and then your parents told you, oh, let me just deal with this, rather than just listening to you. Or maybe friends, they can invalidate you. They can just not listen to your problems, not have time to just pour out your emotions. So poor emotional regulation skills is quite common. It's quite common in people who are struggling with their mental health, struggling with their relationship with food, because they don't have any outlet to release these emotions. So they try to find these emotions fulfilled with food, which is why we have binge eating episodes. And when we feel the guilt and the shame before and after binge eating episodes, also maybe during the binge eating episodes, then we try to bottle it up and just focus on the food. So poor emotional regulation skills, binge eating. And when I struggled with binge eating, I didn't think anything about emotions. I just wanted to eat the food and then I'd feel guilty. I thought there's no way to cope with emotions because they were so strong. The guilt is so strong. The shame, the embarrassment was so strong. I thought there was no way to cope with it. But in this episode, I'm going to be talking about how you can cope with difficult emotions before and after. So let's get straight to it. So here are 4 things you can do to think about when you're struggling with difficult emotions. So the first thing is to be mindful. So what does mindful look like? So before the binge, I want you to think, okay, why am I feeling these urges to binge? What has triggered this? What emotions am I feeling right now? Am I feeling worried? Am I feeling anxious? Or am I feeling nervous that I'm having these binge eating episodes? Or maybe I'm not feeling anything at all because I know it's probably going to be coming and I can't control it. And afterwards, after the binge, what am I feeling now? Am I feeling relief? Am I feeling shame? Am I feeling guilt? Am I feeling angry or sad? So it's important to be aware of these emotions because, as I mentioned earlier, if you've been invalidated of your experiences, then you can start by validating your experiences. So if you're feeling sad, okay, it's nice to feel that I'm being sad. I accept that I'm feeling sad. And the key thing with binge eating recovery is to accept these emotions, accept these difficult emotions rather than pushing them away. So another thing that might be helpful is that if you're struggling to pinpoint what emotions you're feeling, even if you could write down one emotion, that's enough. You don't have to write down 5 emotions. The next time you have these difficult emotions, write it down in a journal. What time is it? What am I feeling right now? Have I just eaten? Maybe I haven't eaten. Is a binge urge quite strong, or am I having no urge at all? Write it down as a journal to be aware of your emotions and what might trigger them. And number 2, let's get to the really meaty bits of this video. So number 2, let's talk about the skill of urge surfing. So the skill of urge surfing is really helpful, but it's not something that's going to put an end to your binges. But the key thing about urge surfing is that you're trying to create this gap between urge and action. Especially, this is really helpful, especially if you're struggling with the idea that once you feel the urge come, then you just prepare for a binge. You're buying all the snacks, you go to a store, you just feel like you're helpless against the binge. But it's important to know that with urge surfing, you're creating this gap between urge and action, and in this gap you have more room, you have more time for logic to sink in and trying to increase these emotional regulation skills. And number 3, we're going to talk about the skill of opposite action. So opposite action is if you're feeling difficult emotions or you feel like you want to take action on something, then do the opposite of that. So opposite action is really helpful because when you're feeling difficult emotions, especially after a binge, then all logic goes out the window. Your emotional mind takes over. And sometimes when we're covered or like filled with difficult emotions, we can do quite rash things. We can think about quite rash things. So opposite action is trying to revert that into logic. So if you've been struggling with binge eating episodes for so long, you might have noticed that you're in this cycle of restriction, binge, restrict, binge. So after a binge, you feel like you want to restrict, cut out food groups, and go on a even stricter diet. But with opposite action, how about we do the opposite, which will hopefully lead for a different outcome. So if you're feeling guilt, shame, embarrassment, try to find actions or things that will try to remove that guilt, shame, and embarrassment. Try to focus on self-care, self-love. So things could be, you can just go for a bath, maybe try to go for a nice walk outside, things that you find quite relaxing. So you're trying to associate post-binge with self-care rather than self-guilt. And then if you feel like you're gonna cut out breakfast tomorrow, have a salad for lunch. How about we do the opposite of that? Instead of restriction, we give permission. That's really important to note because if we're trying to do the opposite of our urges emotionally, then it might lead to a different outcome. Maybe you're not gonna have a binge tomorrow. And I'm not saying you just by implementing opposite action, you're not gonna binge ever again. It's gonna turn this all around. But the thing is, the key thing about emotional regulation with opposite action is that you're trying to associate post-binge or binge eating episodes afterwards with self-care rather than self-guilt or trying to bring yourself down. And number 4 is a really helpful skill. This is a helpful skill before a binge, but it can be helpful after a binge. So this is cold water immersion therapy. So if you're feeling difficult emotions, you're feeling the urge to binge, then splash yourself really cold water. You can just go to a sink and splash yourself in the face with cold water. And it might sound silly, but essentially what you're doing here is that if you splash yourself with cold water, if you're feeling difficult emotions or urges, then you're trying to trigger this, what they call the dive reflex. So it's trying to restart your nervous system into removing all these difficult emotions. And it might be helpful, but it's not going to end your binge eating urges. These are just emotional regulation skills. And this can be passed on to other difficult times. If you're finding the urge to do something difficult other than binge eating, like, get mad at a friend because you recognize that your friend did something quite mean to you or said something quite mean to you, and you're about to do something quite mean, splash yourself with freezing cold water. I mean, it doesn't have to be freezing, but something that's cold in the sink. And that can really restart your nervous system and restart your brain into logic rather than emotion. So you're trying to turn these emotional minds into the reasonable minds, the logic mind. And there's lots of little studies on cold water immersion therapies, like people jumping into cold water baths or cold sea swimming, that improves their mental health, reduces depression. I'm not saying that cold water immersion therapy is going to cure everything, but it's really good in restarting your nervous system if you're feeling difficult emotions during the moment. So I hope you found this episode quite helpful, and essentially these are a few emotional regulation skills, or should I say distress tolerance skills, when you're feeling the urge to binge, or when you binged and you don't really know what to do. You're starting to feel difficult emotions. So if you found this video really helpful, then I'd really appreciate it if wherever you're listening to this to, YouTube, podcasts, to follow me, like, subscribe, comment if you can, if it's on YouTube. And I'd really appreciate it if you check the link in the description of wherever you're listening to this to for my free resources, my hunger regulation ebook and webinar, my binge freedom course, my one-to-one coaching, my blog, and so many more. So I'd really appreciate it if you check those out. And to also check out here, if you're listening to this on YouTube, for my latest video. And if there's no latest video here, I really appreciate it that you're new here, and I'm looking forward to being with you throughout this whole journey. And comment below also if you want any specific topics for me to talk about on binge eating recovery. And I'll see you in the next episode. See ya!